Now, because of the March on Washington, Lyndon Johnson is listening to Martin Luther King Jr. To full effect. So, in this picture, you see Martin Luther King Jr. meeting with the president. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was heavily influencing in getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Um, this act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. So, really, any form of discrimination you could think of is going to be outlawed by the federal government in 1964. This act is also going to desegregate public accommodations. So, facilities all across the United States are going to be told to integrate. Now, it's going to take many, many years for all the states to fully be on board with that. But without this act, it was never going to happen. And like I said, President Lyndon Johnson was listening to the people, and he played an important role in the passage of the act. It was the brainchild of those two. Now, another major piece of legislation was based off voting rights. Um, we need to remember the 15th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War was supposed to dictate that everyone had voting rights, but states were finding very evil ways around this. So, what you see on the screen here is a literacy test. Now, some of the evil things the states would do to keep people from voting was that people in charge of the states knew that separate but equal schools didn't lead to equal educations. So, where many white students could read because of the conditions of their school, many impoverished African American citizens could not because of the state of their school. So, in order to vote in the early 60s and 50s, people would have to show that they could read. Now, this was a racist act directly targeted at African Americans. They never said formally on paper that it was, but the politicians knew what they were trying to do. So, people who had a good reading level could, read this semi-fine and go vote. But people with a less than first grade education couldn't, it was hard for them to read. All right. I've been reading for 29 years and I can barely do this. I don't know about anybody else out there. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to get passed, and it's going to outlaw several things. It's going to outlaw literacy tests. There should not be any barriers to voting. There shouldn't have to be poll taxes or literacy tests. If you're born in the United States, you get to vote. All right. And it's also going to lead to the enfranchisement of many African American citizens. So federal registrars are going to move down south to get people to register to vote. There are some counties in the South where 90% of the population was black, but 90% of the people voting in that county were white. So this evened out the odds and became more representative of the government. And as a result, more African Americans are going to go to the polls. Because remember, the most powerful thing a United States citizen can do is go vote. You can't change laws if you're not going out and trying to change them. And once again, Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, he was heavily influential in getting the Voting Rights Act passed. All right. So he kind of gets credit for it, but really the people pushing this were Martin Luther King Jr. and everybody else that was part of the civil rights movement, trying to get equality between the races.